Welcome to Brain Ponderings, conversations with scientists at the forefront of brain research. Today it's my pleasure to host Professors Visar Berisha and Julie Liss, and they have developed a very productive collaboration based on their differential expertise in development and applications of automated speech analysis for the assessment of brain, I would say, functional trajectories in different groups of people. It could be someone, for example, with mild cognitive impairment or other neurological disorders, or maybe it's normal aging, something I'm interested in a lot. I'm getting older. We're all getting older. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
So I guess let's start with Julie. So your background, your training is in psychology and kind of speech and hearing communication. And how did you get interested in that? So I guess you could go back to early life.
Yeah, let's see. I'll go back there. I was interested in communication disorders when I became, I think, a sophomore in my undergraduate, and I went on to graduate school to get a master's degree and become a speech language pathologist. And during that time, I got very interested in the research aspects of the discipline. So I got my PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I studied kind of the normal aspects of speech and hearing science, and especially with tools like speech acoustics and perceptual analysis of speech. And my fascination was around how different diseases and different pathologies manifest differently in speech and language. And so much of my early career was examining and characterizing speech in different clinical populations, many neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's, ALS, ataxia, Huntington's disease, things like that. And my work funded through the National Institutes of Health allowed us to collect a large amount of data, speech samples from different individuals with impairments, and we were able to characterize acoustically the things that were specific to different types of diseases. And that work was very labor intensive, so had an army of graduate students creating spectrograms and doing measurements by hand and things like that. And we made a lot of, I would say, important discoveries and so forth, but didn't really have the impact that one would hope on the clinical practice. And so there, in part of it was just the stuff we were doing was very, very labor intensive and not really scalable to something that was something that could be used in the clinic. So I'll kind of pass it over to Visar at this point, because this is where our collaboration started.
Yeah, so my interests in the area date back to my undergraduate days. So I was an undergraduate in here at Arizona State University, and my area of research is speech signal processing, speech analysis. And what really drew me to signal processing as a field, not necessarily speech signal processing, was it seemed like a very, very interesting application of math. So obviously, as an engineer, you end up taking lots of different math classes. They're all beautiful in their own ways. And finding an application where you can use math in order to manipulate signals that are real, physiological signals, was quite interesting. And so I decided to pursue a PhD. And during my PhD, I really focused on speech analysis. And what drew me to speech signal processing, speech analysis as a field, was the fact that it was a very interdisciplinary field. I mean, if you think about who studies speech and sound, physicists study sound and propagation of sound. Certainly linguistics and social scientists study sound. clinicians study the way that we produce speech. Engineers develop algorithms to produce speech. So it was really exciting as a field. You had to sort of learn about a number of different areas. And when I met Julie, she introduced me to this field of pathological speech processing. So analysis of speech from different different produced by individuals with different neurological conditions. And this was around 2013 or so, 2012. It was very, very clear that there was very nice synergy between our skills. She had this amazing background and this amazing set of data that she had collected over the years. And there was clearly an opportunity to apply tools from engineering in order to automate, to make more efficient some of these processes that she mentioned earlier, processing the speech samples.
Okay, so let's kind of talk about the methods a little bit before you to get into the data and your findings. And so presumably you're making recordings of people talking. And then what happens with those? How do you go about analyzing them in a reproducible manner? And also kind of teasing out, I guess you have to, anything like this, you have to have like, what's normal? I guess first is what's normal? How much variability is there within the normal range? I mean, people kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like individual people may have some variability, even if they grew up speaking the same language in the same part of the country and are both healthy. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's variability within person. Even if you ask the same person to repeat the same phrase 2 days in a row without any change in their clinical condition, there's variability. So variability, I think, is sort of key here. But really, the process of analysis starts well before actually collecting any data. So very broadly speaking, the sorts of analyses that we look at are analyzing what people say and how they say it. So what people say in terms of the language content, so lots of different conditions impact your ability to produce, complex sentences with high idea density. Alzheimer's disease, for example, or other forms of dementia may impact your ability to recall the right word in the right context, for example. And then the second aspect, how you say it. There are lots of different neurological conditions impair your ability to achieve your articulatory targets, to move the muscles in a way that results in clear and intelligible speech, right? And so as we think about what conditions we're interested in, we first design what are the most effective ways that we can elicit speech from people in order to maximize our ability to detect these changes of interest, right? So for example, in patients with dementia, you might design some speech elicitation task that taxes memory. And as a result, then when you analyze the resulting speech, you know what you're looking for.
Okay.
And so Julie, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, so I think the kind of a key part here is the knowing what you're looking for. So you can really get a jump on some of these sort of black box models where you just go in and see if there are differences between two groups. You can get a jump on that by kind of filtering to what you know from a clinical standpoint is going to have the most signal. So for example, if memory loss is going to have the most signal and you're providing an elicitation task that taxes memory so that they're going to struggle remembering the details of a story or a word list or what you may have, you have the ability then to target your analysis on those sorts of things that will be indicative of that memory loss. whether it be in the way someone says something with the crispness of their articulation, the speed of their speech, whether they take pauses, or what they're saying, the words that they use. So having a kind of a clinical filter of content expertise, so we kind of know what we're looking for, gives us the ability to have some interpretable outcomes from our work.
And it would seem important in that case to have to see how things are changing over time, right? So you mentioned there's a lot of inter-individual variability. So maybe someone you're testing and they're showing like indications of some memory problems, but maybe if you go back 10 years before that, they were pretty much like that already. Or, I mean, how do you, maybe that's an extreme example, but
Yeah.
how do you account for that?
So, there's no magic bullet. I think there's this sort of perception that perhaps if you bring artificial intelligence or machine learning to bear on a problem, then you can bypass some of these things. And I think fundamentally, you still have these inherent information limits. Like if you want to detect whether or not someone is different in some way from a normative population, then your ability to detect that will depend on how much variability there is in the general population. And so I think a more effective use of speech analysis actually is within individual tracking. So one of the really nice things about speech is that it's relatively easy to collect, and it's relatively easy to collect remotely. For example, you can have participants provide a brief speech sample, 1, 2, 3 minutes, once a day or once a week over the course of a few months or a year, depending on how long you want to track them. And now you're looking at changes within individual.
Yeah.
So you really are able to account for that variability. The within individual variability is much more modest than variability in the general population. And so these are some
I
of
see.
the, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. We just published a paper where part of it was in older individuals at risk for dementia because of had obesity and insulin resistance, and Sophia Frangio up at Mount Sinai developed this thing. It's kind of an indicator of relative brain age, and in that case, it's based on MRI measuring like white matter, gray matter, and then like they did this on 4,000 or 5,000 normal people, healthy people of different ages, right? And they trained it's kind of they trained it on those data, and then when we published, you can kind of estimate someone's brain age within the normal range. Now, one thing with brain aging, we start to decline in a lot of ways, actually, when we're in our 40s. There's a drop off in a lot of our executive functions, even in memory, right? And so I guess one question is that there are a lot of questions about whether older people in positions of responsibility, whether it's in the military or, I don't know, airline pilot or something, as they get older, are they declining in their abilities, their executive functions that could affect the lives of the people? So, so in that case, isn't it useful? Are you saying you can't really do it with the speech analysis to like train a computer on a bunch of different people at different ages and then see how that compares? Because everybody's declining. There seems to be a couple of downward inflections, one in the 40s, one in maybe late 60s or so.
Yeah, I think from just like a single speech sample, collected at any given point in time, I think you'd be hard pressed to do something like that. I
Okay.
think, you know,
Yeah.
the sorts of application that I've seen in the use cases that you mentioned is identifying fatigue, for example. If you're,
Yeah.
say, a pilot or you're in
Yeah.
the Air Force and you have some high stakes job, then perhaps, you know, you have a baseline and then relative to that baseline. But typically those sorts of problems aren't solved using just speech. There's other sensors that are used to measure other,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, the fatigue's important. I'm usually most alert and functioning best in the mornings because I don't eat breakfast. Actually, brain functions well in the fasted state. But then, like right now, I ate lunch not too long ago, and I'm feeling a little sleepy, and so I'm probably not as sharp as I normally am.
Well, we certainly can't tell.
Oh,
Okay,
no.
Julie, were you going to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say something that I think is an example of things that don't necessarily decline over time. So one thing, for example, is your vocabulary,
Right.
vocabulary size.
Yeah.
And that actually seems to increase, you know, throughout
Yeah.
modestly as we get older, but it tends to increase. So if you see declines in the use of rich vocabulary, for example, in speech, that can be an indication of some cognitive things going on.
I
So,
see.
you know, all things being equal, you shouldn't really see a decline. So when you do see a decline, it makes you, you know, send up a little yellow flag and,
Okay.
and say, you know, what's going on.
Why don't you two, so you've collaborated on so many studies, I picked out 5 here. Now this kind of ask you these in chronological order. So longitudinal changes in linguistic complexity, which is what you were just mentioning, Julie, I think, among professional football players. So talk about that study and how it's done and what your findings were.
Sure, yeah. Yes, this is something that started with a graduate student who was very much interested in 3 things. So the first is the brain, the second is signal analysis, and the third is football. And so, of course, he had seen a lot of the work on the impact of concussions on professional football players, and you know, he came up with this very clever idea. Before and after every football game, they do a series of press interviews, the players do. And so he thought, well, if we actually download this data and analyze it using some of these parameters that Julie just mentioned, we can track over time because we have data from the same individual over many years. And as I mentioned, like this is very difficult to do at a single point in time, but if you start looking at slopes, if you start looking at changes over time, then there is useful information that you can glean. So, you know, that's sort of the setup. Julie, do you want to go over the results?
Yeah, so we actually did the same for were they coaches? What was
Coaches, front
Yeah.
office executives that had never played professional football.
Yeah, non-football players. So we used that as kind of our control. They tended to be a little bit older than our football players, but other than that, we had the same kinds of time intervals. And what we found is that there were a number of players who did decrease on the metrics that we were measuring, and they decreased, whereas the front office folks, I think there was maybe one.
Yeah, there was like one that showed some decline.
Yeah, but there was disproportionately among the players where we saw this decline, where you wouldn't expect in this group of younger individuals any sort of decline, and whether that's a function of the concussions or whether it's a function of they just didn't want to talk as much as they went on in their careers. That's a possibility too, I suppose. But it is it is disturbing if that is a possibility of kind of maybe a premonition of some decline that's starting.
The ones that declined, was it dependent on their position or was it kind of scattered among the positions?
You know, there probably isn't enough data in order to be
Yeah.
able to answer that. There was some, we did this sort of secondary analysis on quarterbacks only and looked at the relationship between how often they're sacked and what their language decline was. But I think that's a little bit of you know, reading tea leaves. It
Yeah.
was a small sample size, yeah.
Yeah.
I had, it's been, I don't know, a year ago on this podcast, Ann McKee, who
Yeah.
did a lot of the main work on CTE and the NFL players. And they did find some linemen seem to be more affected than others. But okay, then the next paper is, well, this is related. Altered speech patterns in subjects with post-traumatic headache due to mild traumatic brain injury.
Yeah, this is a study that we did in collaboration with Mayo Clinic.
Hmm.
And there's a group of individuals that post some form of TBI. They experience a persistent headache. And the purpose of that study, not necessarily the focus of this particular paper, the purpose of that broader study was to understand whether we could predict, prognose whether someone's headache would go away versus when it would versus remaining persistent. So in that work, there had been, I think, other than this study that we had conducted on the impact of migraine on speech, there had been very little work on analyzing the relationship between headache and speech patterns. And so this was sort of an initial study to look at both cross-sectionally, but then also longitudinally within individual during times when they had a headache versus when they didn't, what aspects of speech changed. So we had two different types of speech elicitation tasks. So the first was this sort of brief spontaneous speech sample where we're asking the individuals to describe their day the previous day, so what they did from start to finish. And the second was a reading task, or reading a series of sentences. And there was a couple of findings that stood out. The first is when they were experiencing a headache, they tended to speak slower, so their articulators moved slower. And the second is that their pause rate was increased, meaning the pause time between words was longer. So one of the interpretations of that is that when they're in this headache state, there's perhaps some impact on cognitive linguistics, right? It takes you a bit longer to think about what word you're going to say next. It takes you a little bit of time to think about what you did yesterday prior to being able to produce those the speech.
Well, and what about I think a lot about the circuitry in the brain and so with speech, obviously you've got a motor component. Oftentimes you also have an auditory component. And, so somehow there has to be circuits that are like organizing what's going to be said and then generating the motor pattern for speech. Have you, or do you have plans to try to start looking into the brain or comparing maybe, I think, did you do this? I can't remember. Comparing, yeah, like EEG, right? You did a study with, you had EEG data and your speech analysis data in the same subjects. Is that right?
In concussion, right? Was that the concussion?
No, this isn't stuttering.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Right. With Sean's,
yeah,
Sean's work.
that's
Mhm.
right.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. So I see. So Visar, you're the last author on this. Either that means you're the oldest, or or you took the lead in the study.
So I think it depends on which study you're talking about. So if this is the one looking at
It's very
different,
recent. Came out this summer in speech language hearing research, motor planning in stuttering adults.
yeah, that particular study was an EEG only study. So we weren't actually looking at
Oh,
samples. I mean, there was a
okay.
speech production component, but we were simply looking at differences in two different conditions between individuals that stutter and those that that don't. And so the idea there was to actually bring to bear more advanced techniques to analyze the EEG signal. So looking at machine learning models that analyze the clustering between different groups. So there was two conditions in the experiment, and the idea was to compare how the EEG signals were different in those two conditions between healthy individuals and those that stutter.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I was going to say that the conditions had to do with the planning phase of speech production. So before you say something, there's an interval where your articulators are going to get ready to produce the speech.
Yeah.
There's a hypothesis that in stuttering, that interval is impaired. So the expectation would be that when people are preparing to actually speak versus when they're preparing to just read something in their head, that there would be differences in those two groups based on those two conditions. So
okay, so then in disorders of communication, which Julie, you've spent a lot of time working on, right? Can you give some examples of specific disorders of speech? And well, this is a whole nother multiple podcasts, I guess, but and what the problem seems to be in the brain, where and what.
sure. So I guess we could start with Parkinson's disease because that's a very common neurodegenerative disorder, and it involves the dysfunction in the basal ganglia, and the function of the basal ganglia in speech production and other movements is really in the scaling of movements and the initiation of movements. So in Parkinson's disease, we see kind of a downscaling or down regulation of movement. So in gait, you can see that the steps become shorter and there's more of a kind of a shuffling. And something similar happens with speech where the articulatory excursions are reduced because of this. And so speech tends to sound more mumbled. It sounds kind of rushed, or sometimes it can be slowed, but it tends to not be as crisp and clear. And the voice also becomes breathy and weak and kind of hoarse sounding. And so upwards of 85% of people with Parkinson's disease eventually will have this kind of dysarthria, which is hypokinetic dysarthria. So that's one variety. Another example would be amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, where individuals have degeneration of their motor neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. And when the degeneration is occurring in those motor neurons in the brainstem, it's going to affect the muscles of speech and swallowing. And we see a mixed type of dysarthria because both the upper motor neuron and lower motor neurons are being impacted by the pathophysiology of the disease. So we see a combination of a flaccid type dysarthria and a spastic type dysarthria. And so then we see slowed speech, hypernasality, imprecise articulation, a strained, strangled vocal quality that progress in severity with the course of the disease.
And what about developmental disorders of communication, right? Aren't there kids that have some abnormalities that, not necessarily degeneration of motor neurons, but some and other circuits in the brain?
Yeah, for sure. So there are conditions like cerebral palsy where a child has suffered some sort of anoxia or other trauma during or around the time of birth. And this can result in dysarthria is also cognitive impairment in some children, depending on the severity and the distribution of the damage that occurred. And so CP doesn't get, it doesn't degenerate, but because of things like spasticity, there are changes that occur over the child's life and into adulthood that can make the appearance of the problem look different. For example, contractures that occur in the context of muscle spasticity, and speech often is involved with that.
Okay, and then you also had recently a paper, Language and Analytics for Assessment of Mental Health Status and Functional Competency. Is that a review article, or is that
No, that was
original research?
original research. Yeah, that was analyzing two aspects of or two sorts of symptoms that are impacted by both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. So looking at social skills abilities and the downstream impact of impaired social skills, so functional competence, the ability to hold down a job. And so the idea there is clearly speech and language production play an important role in your ability to connect with someone. And there's this existing tool for assessing social skills called the Social Skills Performance Assessment, the SSPA. And it's quite interesting. It's sort of a role-playing task where you have the clinician takes on the role, three different roles. One of them, for example, is a landlord that is a little bit combative. And then you, as the patient in this interaction, have to convince the landlord to come and fix a leak. And so this is a study that we conducted with some clinical partners from Canada, and they had collected the speech samples from patients with both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. These are all evaluated by the clinician following the interaction. However, we also have the language samples from the interaction. So we developed a series of tools to evaluate the coherence of the interactions, how responsive the patient was to the clinician's requests or questions in the interaction. And through a series of algorithms that we developed models to predict social skills, and then also looked at correlations between the outputs of these models and other standard scales, negative symptoms, positive symptoms, and then, as I mentioned, these sort of the objective assessment of these downstream functional competency scores.
How much does the automation accelerate the pace of the research? Julie, you mentioned, I think early on, that in Wisconsin you'd have to do things more kind of by hand analysis.
It's gone from weeks to months to seconds.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is one hidden cost. So the hidden cost is a lot of these sort of manual tools for measuring speech, right, or evaluating some aspect of speech production have been operationally defined over the years, right? There's standard practices for doing this. One of the things that's happened lately in the speech analysis literature and the speech AI literature is that there's really no shortage of tools to evaluate speech. So the hidden cost I'm referring to is actually the hidden cost associated with validating that the particular one that you've selected actually works, and operationally defining it and evaluating how repeatable it is, understanding what the test, retest reliability is, understanding variability in the general population. So after you go through that process, then it's very quick to apply.
So historically, then, there are instances of not being able to reproduce previous results because of this problem of not validating?
Yeah. I mean, this is actually sort of what I'd call maybe even a mini crisis in AI-based science and ML-based science, machine learning-based science. I think every time that, not every time, but in the past, there's lots of examples where you've had individuals apply these very powerful tools that have large degrees of freedom on these relatively small data sets, right? I mean, in general, compared to more what you might call consumer applications, clinical applications tend to have smaller data sets. There's less data availability. And so there, you get these over-optimistic results. You might have two different labs analyzing exactly the same data set. Perhaps one gets some accuracy of 75%, but the other one gets an accuracy of 85%. And due to the it's not because one lab is doing something wrong versus right. I think it's just a function of variability in the small sample size. However, only one of these labs is likely to publish their results. And as a result, you create, because of publication bias, you create this perception that these tools work really, really well.
Yeah. That's a problem. And I think we've been guilty of that over the years, tending not to publish or pursue negative data, where there's no difference between the control and the experimental group. And it is a problem, but it's getting really complicated now. There's so many different journals, right? And I don't know about you two, but I don't look at a lot of journals anymore because I don't, there's so many publications coming out all over the place. So I kind of focus on some of the higher profile journals within the field I'm working on, and then go from there, and then maybe look back and see what else is published. But a lot of journals are encouraging, or some, not a lot, but some are encouraging publication of negative results. And that's a good thing as long as people pay attention to them.
Yeah. I think that it's become really difficult to keep up, and it's also become really difficult to kind of figure out what you should focus on and what not to focus on. Which papers should you dive into versus those that you should set aside. So I think it's become more challenging than it used to be. We published a paper recently on over optimism in clinical speech AI. And so this is kind of like at least for me, I think it's the first time I'd ever done a meta-analysis type study. I'm not sure about Julie, but it was really quite interesting. The main takeaway was that this very interesting figure. The smaller the sample size in your data set, the more likely you were to report higher accuracy values in a using machine learning in clinical speech AI. And so the idea there is that it's easier to achieve higher accuracy with a small sample size just due to chance or perhaps to some sort of overfitting. But nevertheless, that's not what you'd expect with a model that's been properly trained using machine learning. You'd expect the opposite.
Yeah, you'd expect that. And maybe this goes back to what you just said about not publishing negative results.
Yeah, this is sort of one of the things that we posited.
Because maybe if you have a small sample size, you may get a positive result, but actually, because it was a small sample size, just by chance, you got that statistically significant result.
That's right.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about the pitfalls and the promise of these technologies. With a lot of technologies that are becoming automated, they're becoming personalized too. Is there any value in? Oh, I forgot to mention this, that both of you are co-founders of a company, Aura. Is that right?
Right.
And what's the goal of that study? I mean, it's a company, so in theory, there must be some monetary goal, but also something where you're developing something that can help patients or clinicians or the general public?
Yeah, so the main idea of that work, and neither one of us is with the company anymore,
Ah,
actually, so we stepped away. But I'll sort of talk a little bit about the aim. The aim was really to bridge the gap between um, impact at the level of having a publication and impact at the level of impacting patients in clinical care. And it was clear that beyond publishing a study, really needed to work to productize these tools if you wanted a chance at real world impact. And we did have some very nice real world impact. Julie, if you want to share.
Sure. So when we started this, people didn't really know what we meant by we're analyzing speech to, as a window into the brain, or there was not a great appreciation for the richness of the speech signal and what you could learn from analysis of it. So it was a little bit of an uphill climb to just from a standpoint of having people understand what we were attempting to do. But once we were able to get that message across, we eventually had success in working with pharma companies in clinical trials. And in one particular case, our metrics were able to identify improvements or no, not declining in patients with ALS. And even when the primary outcome measures were not successful in that. So it was a demonstration that speech could be more sensitive than those primary measures that were functional rating scales. And so it led to FDA granting breakthrough designation for our tool. So it was a good, it was very, very good, because I think it demonstrated the power of speech analytics, and also, opens up possibilities for not having failed clinical trials in these diseases that are so incredibly devastating, and, so offers some hope.
And early diagnosis is a big issue, whether it's Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, right? So the idea being you want to identify the people in the early stages of diseases, because by the time they're in ALS, your muscles are wasting and you're starting to show real weakness and so on. Or in Alzheimer's, by the time your short-term memory is clearly having a lot of problems, or in Parkinson's, the movement problems. Clinical trials have failed, right, in all of these in terms of modifying the progression of the disease. And so it's really important and you would think that the earliest alterations that are probably occurring are subtle ones that involve alterations in neural network activity that don't lead to obvious deficits, but you may be able to detect by some method. One thing we worked on a lot is excitotoxicity. And we think that hyperexcitability of neural networks is occurring very early in Alzheimer's disease, before symptom onset. And in fact, Alzheimer's patients have a much greater incidence of seizures than do age-matched control subjects. But this excitatory imbalance seems to be occurring in a lot of other things, ALS included. So, yeah, it would be interesting. So the one thing with human speech, obviously, it's very complex. We have very complex language, and whereas there are some models for certain neurological disorders in animals, I don't know if the animals' vocalizations, I should know that, I guess. I'm not sure if there's been any papers on like a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease where they develop plaques and tangles and cognitive impairment. I haven't seen it. That doesn't mean it hasn't been done. Like analysis of vocalizations, because these animals have we can't hear, actually. They're at frequencies that we can't hear. They have these vocalizations. So that would be interesting to look at and compare. Is there any, do you ever even look at the animal literature, the rodent literature?
Yeah, there is a mouse model for vocalizations, ultrasonic vocalizations of mice, I believe, in Parkinson's disease. So that's been explored.
Hmm.
But I don't think there's been an analogous sort of model for vocalizations in other types of diseases. So
Okay. Yeah. All right. Let's see. So you mentioned there's fluctuations in the speech complexity, for example, depending on whether the person's fatigued from day to day, week to week, maybe the time of day, and so on. What about like something like sleep deprivation? If someone's sleep deprived, does that show up in their speech? I guess that they'd be fatigued. And then on the other hand, does regular exercise or keeping your mind intellectually challenged or intermittent fasting or well, I know one's looked at this, I don't think, but would those things be interesting to look at and like follow the same individuals, and I don't know, have them do exercise regularly for 2 weeks and then don't do it for 2 weeks in kind of uh, a switch over design or something like that to look at how environmental influences, lifestyle factors might affect speech patterns.
We did this large-scale data collection at some point, where we were looking at speech changes, or actually it wasn't speech changes because it was cross-sectional, not longitudinal, across hundreds of individuals, and we asked them a series of self-reported questions. The main idea there was to try and get an understanding of how speech varies in the general population. The general population that's perhaps represented by different exercise patterns, different levels of sleep issues. So we've done it at that scale. We haven't done it within individual in the general population in order to study a particular aspect of everyday lifestyle, like sleep, for example, or exercise. I mean, you can sort of think about different types of changes that might occur.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And there's quite a bit of evidence now that on average, people with obesity and insulin resistance don't do as well on cognitive testing as do age-matched, normal weight, non-insulin resistant people. And actually, this has even been shown in children and adolescents with obesity. So that would be an interesting thing to look at too, because it involves energy metabolism, and obviously your brain energy metabolism is very important. We think that there's impaired ability of neurons to use glucose, take up and use glucose. That occurs early in Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment. Now, on the other hand, ketones seem to be good for at least cognition. I guess I'm giving you a bunch of ideas for experiments you don't have money to do yet, but
Yeah, these are all good grant ideas. Yeah, this is
okay. If you want me to be an unpaid consultant, I'd be happy to.
thank you.
Yeah, I'm retired now, so I'm doing this and doing some writing in the mornings and then goofing off. I have a year-and-a-half-old granddaughter that comes over 3 or 4 days a week for half a day.
that's awesome.
So, okay. Is there anything else you'd like to end with? Anything I didn't ask you that very exciting, or because you've done a lot of work? I know we didn't cover a lot of it, and there's undoubtedly some gaps in what I've asked you. We've got a few minutes, right?
Yeah.
I think I think I would just highlight what we were talking about in the beginning of this podcast. The blending of disciplines in this kind of work is really critical, and it's critical from the very get-go, right? It's not kind of bringing one side or the other in after something's been conceptualized. It really has to start from the very beginnings of a research study so that it can be designed in a way that's really optimized for finding the important results. And I think we've discovered over the years, and obviously this happened organically, and we've merged our labs, so our students study together and kind of tackle things in an interdisciplinary context. But the value of that, I think it's hard to appreciate unless you've actually experienced it. So, that's why we want to train students in that context and encourage others to really find those collaborators who can be there from day one.
Yeah, the interdisciplinary collaboration, facilitates the design and kind of refining what the important experiments, and it accelerates the pace of discovery, which you've mentioned too.
And from like just a curiosity perspective, it leads to so many interesting questions.
Yeah,
Like questions that you probably wouldn't consider if you were working on this in more of a siloed way.
yeah,
And then from like the engineering perspective, we like objective numbers, but the objectivity here is like you can do more with less once you start thinking about the problem in an interdisciplinary way. What I mean is that you can certainly there's always going to be data limitations. You're always going to wish you had more data, but you can squeeze more juice out of the data lemon if you're able to think about it in a more holistic way rather than just applying the tools that are available in your own personal toolkit.
yeah. I learned that when I was a postdoc. I was doing developmental neuroscience, but every year I'd go to the cell biology meetings because they were way ahead in understanding whatever mitochondrial function or autophagy or any of these cellular processes. So I go there and then I get a lot of ideas to how to apply that to neurons where those things hadn't ever been looked at in the neurons.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's really good. Today, there's so much kind of tunnel vision. People are focused on one specific problem, one specific receptor for a neurotransmitter or and I don't think there's enough scientists that are kind of looking at the big picture and trying to put what seemingly disparate findings together to try to understand how everything's working together. And certainly that's important for the brain. We need to know
Yeah.
how things work together. Okay, thanks a lot. Fall is here, so hopefully it'll be cooling down there in Arizona and you can get outside more. And thanks for taking the time. I enjoyed talking with you. I learned a lot, and I hope you enjoyed it.
We did. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. This was great.
Yes.
Thanks for the invite again.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.